My name is Dennis O'Connell, and this is Masterpiece Philosophy. 10 kinds of personality disorders are delineated in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders from the American Association of Psychiatry. The DSM clusters these personality disorders into 3 distinct groups. In this video, I'd like to argue that Cluster B personality disorders, the dramatic, emotional, or erratic kind, are misunderstood by the DSM-5. I will argue that the Cluster B personality disorders should not be thought of as mental illnesses as they are described in the DSM. They ought to be understood as moral dysfunctions of personhood. I will reject the theory of mental illness found in the DSM-5 as it pertains to personality disorders, since it mistakes a medical problem for a moral one, has no consistent theory of dysfunction, and cannot sufficiently distinguish between mere deviant behavior and genuine mental illness. Though I disagree with the conception of mental illness found in the DSM-5, I promise not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I will still preserve a realist theory of mental illness, but that theory will be based on a moral Cummins theory of mental illness rather than a biopsychosocial model of mental illness which is found in the DSM-5. Moreover, once I have established that Cluster B personality disorders should be considered differently, I will extend my argument so that personality disorders from all 3 clusters should be treated as moral dysfunctions of personhood, which require moral treatment and not medical treatment. The DSM, the most prominent reference text for practicing psychiatrists and medical professionals, presents this definition for mental disorders. Rather than reading the entire definition, let me provide you with the essential 5 key characteristics of mental disorders as they are defined here. According to this definition, mental disorders are, first, clinically significant disturbances in cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior. Second, reflect a dysfunction in biological, psychological, or developmental processes. Third, usually cause distress or disability. Fourth, are not culturally approved responses. And fifth, are not a purely problem between individual and society. It is implied by this conception of mental disorder that mental illnesses are located in the person who has them, not in the environment, represent a dysfunction in that person, harm their processor, are in accordance with the likeness argument, which essentially says that mental illnesses are as real as and are therefore as similar to physical illnesses in their localizability, degree of harm, material properties, and so on. The model provided by the DSM for mental disorders is known as the biopsychosocial model of mental disorder because it aims to hybridize mental disorders as they are understood from the biological perspective, the psychological perspective, and the social one. Critics, such as Nasi Gami, argue that the DSM's biopsychosocial model is not a unified model of dysfunction at all, since it actually contains 3 separate and unique theories of dysfunction that do not go together. Some dysfunctions, after all, are purely biological or neurological, while others are purely psychological, and some are even purely social. Jerome Wakefield argues that this attempt to synchronize the perspectives on mental illnesses has made it difficult to get at the root causes of mental dysfunctions, since there is no one coherent theory of dysfunction present in the DSM. They might acknowledge that in the DSM, they can point to a dysfunction in a person by checking symptoms of persons, but it cannot go about assigning cause or responsibility because it lacks this coherent theory of dysfunction. Wakefield might argue that in the preceding age of diagnostic psychiatry, medical professionals were better able to treat root causes and ignore symptoms, and therefore had a better grasp at separating problems in living from mental illnesses. I argue that we need a more coherent theory of dysfunction for mental illnesses. In order to fill this void, there are 3 prominent theories of function pertaining to mental illnesses that ought to be considered as replacements. There is Jerome Wakefield's harmful etiological theory of dysfunction, the propensity theory of dysfunction, and the Cummins theory of dysfunction. Jerome Wakefield urges us to adopt his theory of dysfunction, which he refers to as the harmful etiological account of dysfunction. The hope is that with this theory, one will be allowed to assign causes to all illness, mental or physical, in a way that is mind-independent, objective, and scientific. This theory proposes that something ought to be considered an illness if it violates an evolutionary function and is both harmful to a person. It would explain that a broken hip prevents someone from being able to walk properly, thereby affecting one's ability to survive or reproduce, and also causes objective harm to that person in the form of physical pain. So therefore, it should be considered a dysfunction. Wakefield includes the subjective criterion for harm here because there are certain causes of etiological dysfunction that aren't considered illnesses today. For example, Wakefield would consider a homosexual person as someone who is violating their evolutionary function by choosing not to procreate, but they should not be considered to have a dysfunction because their sexuality causes them no harm and therefore is not representative of a dysfunction. The same might apply to a couple who chooses not to procreate or a couple who decides to have few children in spite of generous economic or social circumstances. There are criticisms of this theory of dysfunction, however. Robert Woolfolk, on the other hand, argues that etiological dysfunctions are flawed since they don't capture what we want from a theory of mental illness. Wakefield's theory is over-inclusive, according to Woolfolk, because it includes spandrels that were bred through evolution but don't necessarily have an evolutionary purpose, such as a human chin. It is also under-inclusive because something like depression could be seen as an evolutionary adaptation where a person becomes introspective after, say, the loss of social standing. The propensity account of dysfunction is also related to evolutionary fitness, but is forward-looking rather than backwards. This theory holds that a dysfunction occurs when something disrupts someone's future evolutionary fitness. By focusing on those things which enhance fitness in any possible environment, historical, current, or future, propensity functions are directly tied to probable future success. This conception solves the over and under inclusivity problem that Wakefield encounters by excluding which may have been evolutionary beneficial in the past and instead focusing on what is causing harm in the near future. But hardly anyone holds this conception of illness today. Its devastating problem is that the fitness criterion cannot explain why many societies and individuals choose behaviors that are not in the benefit of procreation or survival. Why would the healthiest and best of any population, say in America or in England, choose not to procreate? Rather than Wakefield's etiological theory or the propensity theory, I propose that we instead choose a Cummins theory of dysfunction to form the basis of our ethical decision-making regarding the diagnosis of mental illnesses. Cummins functions make no reference to history. They simply describe the causal relations among systems. So for instance, we would say that a function of the heart is to pump blood, not because of its history of natural selection, but because it is an essential component of its circulatory system. A heart attack represents a dysfunction because it compromises the heart's ability to perform its purpose as it is defined by the scientific and medical communities who agree upon the proper role of the heart within its larger system. The vital role that the heart plays in its overarching system is scientifically unproblematic because there is much agreement about the proper function and its role since humans universally disvalue death and suffering. The key to understanding Cummins functions is that a community must agree on the mechanism function within a larger system. While I favor the Cummins theory of dysfunction, I'd like to make a slight modification for the purposes of analyzing cluster B personality disorders. As I see them, mental dysfunctions are best represented by Craig Edwards, who holds a Cummins theory of dysfunction that is distinctly moral. Edwards says that a condition is a mental illness if and only if it is a dysfunction of personhood, or in other words, it undermines our capacities for rationality and agency to such a degree that it becomes that it licenses someone to take the sick role. A moral Cummins theory, as is provided by Edwards, can properly correct the flaws of the biopsychosocial model by unifying it such that there is no confusion regarding cause, and by giving us solid criterion for separating deviant behavior from genuine mental illness. Edwards' theory is a Cummins functional theory because it rests upon a shared agreement about the proper function of personhood, where a person's function is dependent upon their ability to be autonomous and rational. Edwards views the proper functioning of personhood literally, such that he says, It does not refer to a person who fails to meet their social or moral functions, but rather to one who is unable to fully function as a person, owing to impairments in the processes and capacities that are necessary for being a person. First, and most trivially, it seems that the condition we commonly label as mental illness can indeed be described as dysfunctions of personhood. Second, this understanding of mental illness explains why we differentiate mental illness from mere deviant behavior. Someone is only mentally ill if they possess the requisite mental symptoms. Third, and most important, this is the only account of mental illness that can explain why mental illnesses could conceivably be relevant to autonomy and responsibility. In this framework, the ill are separated from the evil by the degree to which they are eligible to take the sick role, which is where someone is a passive victim of their condition, thus removing moral responsibility for having their condition. Depending on the situation, a sick person may not be responsible for having their condition, and also they may not even be morally responsible for seeking their own treatment. In the biopsychosocial model, it is very difficult to separate the criminal from the person with an antisocial personality disorder, because both the criminal and the mentally ill person may meet the same symptoms but have different causes. With the Edwardian moral Cummins functional theory of mental illness, the degree to which we want someone to be held responsible for their actions is the determining factor for considering whether or not someone has a genuine cluster B personality disorder, or is just a criminal who requires justice. Lewis Charland also supports this viewing of certain mental illnesses as moral issues that demand normative responses. He argues, in regards to cluster B personality disorders, that it is impossible to imagine a successful treatment for the cluster B personality disorders that does not involve a moral commitment to therapy. The central issue is whether there exists a moral willingness to change, together with a sustained readiness to make such change. I agree with Charland's argument from treatment because I think that the cluster B personality disorders require moral treatment rather than medical. They are therefore best considered moral dysfunctions rather than mental illnesses in the biopsychosocial sense. Ethical decision-making regarding the responsibility of the mentally ill can be difficult to navigate. It does not necessarily operate within the same efficiency as the biopsychosocial model, because ethics can be complicated and tricky. Luckily for us, Craig Edwards gives us a series of questions that we can ask ourselves to guide our ethical decision-making regarding treatment. Pause your screen now to see what these questions are and how you might consider them to be applied to cluster B personality disorders. Notice how we can apply these same questions to conditions such as cluster A and C personality disorders, alcoholism, or anorexia. I argue that therefore we can think of these conditions in the same way as I am thinking about cluster B personality disorders. These are all moral problems with moral solutions that can be inferred from through ethical reasoning. Neil Levy argues that we shouldn't hold the mentally ill accountable. He believes that there are some that are not fully moral agents with rights and responsibilities because they lack rational control, which is a necessary condition for moral agency. Because certain people with cluster B personality disorders do not have receptivity to reason, nor reactivity to reason, they ought not to be blamed for their actions and should instead be seen strictly as moral patients. In response, I would argue that we still must uphold our ethical values in spite of some persons not having full moral agency. We express our moral values concerning violence, self-control, and social responsibility, even when it is outside the control of such persons. We have to bestow a duty on persons with cluster B personality disorders to take an active and morally responsible role in seeking their own treatment for their conditions, or else we cannot truly hold ethical norms as moral rules for our society. Thank you for listening to tonight's episode of Masterpiece Philosophy. I hope that even if you disagree with my account of cluster B personality disorders, that you may still find something insightful or interesting in our discussion today.